The lecture title is Constructing the Idea, Architecture of the Low Carbon Future. And I'm going to look at the 6 projects you featured in your film, but then talk about, and they're all recent projects, how those ideas have projected into the future. And I will end by talking about some next generation projects. And at the beginning, I'm going to set the 6 projects in the context of the key ideas that drive us forward as architects, that have driven us forward as a practice for the last 30 plus years. So it's, the story of the things that interest us back to when we were 4 students together, then the 6 most recent projects and why we chose them and what they represent. And then at the end, I will talk about the next generation of projects and how those ideas are continuing to run through, but evolve and change. We are steeped in London, but we have a global design community within the office. And I think that's very important. It kind of talks about the import and export of ideas. Every individual who works with us comes from somewhere. They have a personal background, they have a professional background, they have an academic background, and they bring differences and they come together, and you can kind of borrow and learn and find what good looks like. From around the world, there's quite different ways of dealing with problems, and what's a problem in one country is an opportunity in another. So that global engagement, it's not about being global architecture, because I think architecture is a response to the place, the physical place, the moment in time, the people who've come together, and the community in which they're engaging. So it's not generic production of buildings around the world, although there are common threads. But it's actually about the range and benefits of ideas and the cross-exchange of knowledge between people in a project. As a practice, we've always talked about the ordinary, and the ordinary doesn't mean it's good enough for ordinary life. It's saying the ordinary should be extraordinary. It shouldn't be shouting out, but if you look, you might find more and more. And each time you look at a building, you might find more to appreciate, more to like, some bits not to like, but that's okay. You're engaging, and if you're not engaged with it, kind of that's okay too. And the image that we extrapolated for that is Giuseppe Turani's Casa del Fazio, which again plays on this idea of use, because it was the house of fascism that after the war became the house of communism. It's now a cultural centre. So a building with a kind of troubled legacy. I mean, let's be honest, I think, there's the Orson Welles line in The Third Man about the Italian Renaissance. He says, look at Switzerland, 500 years of boredom and misery, and you got the cuckoo clock. Look at the Italian, Italy, century of violence, and you get this kind of artistic outpouring. And we were talking earlier about, the RIBA has 380 of the Palladio drawings, because the English gentlemen used to travel pre-Orson Welles, 1700, used to travel to Italy, and when they went through Switzerland, they pulled the blinds down in the carriage because it was too boring. It was the world of the cuckoo clock. So that idea about use, about the problems of where a building's come from, most buildings through history will have some problematic moments in them. That doesn't deny their architectural quality. It is something, we talk about decolonizing buildings. It's something we need to think about, but the way to think about it, in my view, is to communicate the history of that building and what it was used for, and and what might be troubling us now, and what didn't trouble them once in the past. This is a drawing we produce that's become kind of reference idea to underpin that interest in the theatre of everyday life, which is this idea of longevity. A structural engineer friend said recently, it's our time. The frame is the big problem. It's the big carbon problem. So we're responsible for it as engineers. I like to think as architects, we are responsible for it too, because we're not interested in the frame or the services or the architecture. We're interested in the whole thing. But the frame is the first thing that goes up. It's the last thing to come down. If you get that wrong, you might as well forget architecture. So that's kind of, that is the long-term project of the building, generosity. In the 60s, when we squeezed buildings down, we've created a legacy problem. The more generous historical buildings, the warehouses of the 19th century that are around here, they work because they've got volume. It goes back to the long life, loose fit, low energy. We talked then about, that's the theatre, this is the stage set. Parts of the building will have a longevity of 5, 10, 50, 20 years. They are kind of the more permanent architecture. When we worked on the Barbican for 20 years, we were building architectural objects within the bigger project of the Barbican. And then there's the props. These are this is the furniture of everyday life. This is the clothes of the building. This is the things that allow people to kind of make the building theirs, to take it on and do things. Again, going back to history, this is Buckminster Fuller, and he did this, he talked about the operating manual for Spaceship Earth. He did this drawing of the geodesic dome. I think he made 500,000 of them, the most efficient geometrical enclosure of volume, to transform Manhattan. One move, and you transform the way you think about a city and what a building does. And, I think that's actually quite relevant, and particularly so now. So the film, to be tribute to the plan, is so good. I've extended the beginning because it covers most of these projects in a way, and I will move through them at speed. But in a sense, that image to me represents the idea of Burntwood, a historical building that's been repurposed. And then the new buildings, which Paul said, were placed in the opportunities between them, reflecting in that building. And then there's that idea of working with a space at a very pragmatic, low-level brief, and then creating a series of buildings over time in an opportunistic way with an idea, but it shows architecture can happen in more than one way. And the idea here was to recognize the constraint and turn it into the opportunity, this idea of slip form, layers of space, and obviously, a nod to Breuer, but a pragmatic and clever way of making a system that was adaptable and could be rotated so you could create architectural variety. But these are essentially just simple vessels, and the windows are moved as a play within that to distinguish the external form from the internal spaces. And then, of course, the bigger idea, which is the community of school children who use that space and come together. This is Scotland Yard, a complex historical site. Paul talked about the curved glass vessel as a welcoming piece. He didn't mention the fact that there also has to be a bomb-proof welcoming piece. So again, in the most simple design, an extraordinary technological challenge of glass that's 2 inches, 50 millimeters thick. And then this idea of actually, it's, there's a lot of noise made now by some architectural magazines that are less notable than the plan about retrofit as the future. Retrofit is never been any, the architecture is the long history of retrofit. Most buildings you will find are built on the footings of another building. Facades have been kind of removed and reworked. Room linings have been removed and reworked. And this is kind of what we were doing for the first 20 years of our life. We were desperately keen to do something new. And in the end, we realized it's all architecture. And finding something and then working with it is no different than finding a piece of city. We don't clear the whole city so we can do our own thing. And then this, I think, is a rather beautiful drawing I found in the archives of the idea of the reworked, restructured building, and this early idea of the kind of theatre of life behind, and the symbolic importance of architecture, its relationship to government, its relationship formally to historical buildings within its own site and beyond, and how a particular motif used by Norman Shaw can then be played out from a kind of layering of stone and brick into a layer of stones on the ground plane, a kind of reference across time and across planes. And then the end building as both an important public building. I couldn't resist that slide, which is in the archives. Someone quite famous breaking it up. Someone who died recently. It has an important civic role. Buildings have an important role in society. And then this idea also of kind of, talk about the churches and, the plan of Rome, the Nolli plan, but actually, the eternal frame and the idea that actually this building has a meaning to people. Amsterdam, a foreign city, being part of a historical fabric, being part of Gawronski's vision for the building, engaging with him in a discussion, our early diagrams being rather cruder than the piece, but that's the kind of nature of architecture at the early stage, and I think that's okay. The idea of their brief, it's 1 million square foot, but their brief was pretty simple, and we won the competition by saying to them, look, we know that wherever you tell us the brief is, it's not going to be that in the end. We're making a journey through a building, but we're going to organise that journey. We're going to organise the streets and a series of public rooms within the building, and the rest of it, we'll just pour the uses in as your needs change over time. And we invited 6 other European practices to work on little elements within the project. And then this idea of different scales of social engagement in specific venues within the building, but the biggest social engagement of the whole thing is what they call the study landscapes, which is the promenade from the Bradbury building. And then the bigger promenade, this is the interim use. So for 5 years, you entered the building from an island that we built over the canal because we hadn't done phase 2. And we created these journeys within the building, and this idea of vistas and colours and form. And then these are the props within it, some by us, some by others. I don't like particular items within this, but does that matter? They're items of furniture that will come and go. It's nice to control them, but 20 years on, it'll change again. But the bigger picture of the building and the city and its legibility and the public rooms kind of being identified as a piano nobile is, so you're aware that they exist and that you could access them. That idea of an architecture as a journey across time, not one architect, not one practice, not one individual. And then this idea of, making and remaking, retaining, it seems to be a kind of ongoing theme. And then this idea of an intermediate space that's used as an entrance in the first condition. The 60s idea that Craig mentioned in the film, where there is no entrance because everyone's going to arrive by car. And then us making an entrance in the void, and that entrance becoming the public room that connects the students who travel through it into the lecture halls that are like boats that they walk on and then drop into. And then, of course, the bigger idea is this idea that the building, 1 million square foot, is actually transforming the connection of the students to themselves and the university with the town and the gown and the zoo beyond. And actually, it's the only place in Amsterdam where you'll find steps, because Amsterdam's an industrial city. It's the only place where you'll find you can sit. So it's a little bit of English nostalgia, landscape nostalgia, dropped into industrialized Amsterdam's canals. Tower Hamlets, again, a collaboration across time with a suite of architects, with certain architects within the practice, but also external architects, interested in historical building. This idea about, we talked about that, the history of the site, having an emotional resonance. I was talking to Rowan Moore about this. He actually had a very serious illness and health scare in here, and he was very interested in seeing the project on the basis that it actually kind of both shaped his life and saved his life. And then this idea, of course, of the project of making, the project of researching. You're not going to find it in the history, but the history can kind of inspire you to think differently. And actually, the sort of idea of incremental interventions becoming important historically. Again, this idea of the layering of history and the found space. And what, again, is important about this building is generosity. The lesson to learn from this building is generosity, which is then reflected in the idea of the public realm, the idea of reuse, analysis, not over-cleaning, not over-restoring, enjoying that the detail work that the team has gone into, thinking about new materials and old materials and palettes and colours, again, relevance to some of the conversations we had here in the showroom earlier. And then this idea of, we want to make an elevation. It happens, as Paul said, to be around the back. This is what the public are aware of. These are the elevations, around the back as they emerge that have a relationship with the front, but are distinct. And then, of course, Paul talks about the idea about the simplicity of technology, technology of the BIM model to kind of isolate problems. Doesn't always quite do that, but it kind of highlights the three-dimensional complexity of architecture and space and the problems of overly smart buildings. So I always talk about caves rather than oil rigs. If the building's simple, has good thermal capacity and mass and volume, you don't need to over-service it. Like most cars that can do 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, that have computers that could kind of have driven a global bank 30 years ago, buildings are over-designed. But then this shot I like because it's talking about the market setting up, about the building changing its use, becoming something else, being signed, being re-signed, but actually everyday life going on behind. The confidence in that reworking to intervene. And then the idea of actually the old and new coming together is actually a gift. It's not a problem. It's actually a gift that allows kind of a richness and a palette of materials, so you can neutralize one to draw out the qualities of another. And retention, I mean, it's kind of common sense. I mean, the other big carbon story after 100 years of developing air conditioning is we kind of go, well, it's brilliant now, you could open a window. I mean, we're the only people who've kind of forgot, for about a century, we forgot the idea of natural ventilation. And then this attention to detail exists all the way through the process of architecture. So although I talk about constructing ideas, craft, the art, the craft, the use of, think of the FF and the I talked about materials and stage sets and props, but actually attention to detail. And then, of course, this is the old operating theatre that's become an office. Actually, historical memory is quite powerful. Moving on, this is London. Tottenham Court Road was the busiest retail street in London at the turn of the century. It looks pretty busy. This is the sad, dilapidated state, but quite an important corner, not one that would come down. London had a whole series of sites cleared by Crossrail, right next to one of the finest London squares that you enter on the centre lines rather than the corners. This idea of theatre that took 5 or 6 years to establish. And then this idea of the reference of history, the idea of theatre and office as related buildings. They're both containers for life. An early study of it, the politics of planning, the idea architecture is a long game. There are moments where you know what you're doing. We designed a tower at one stage for this site. We knew it wouldn't happen, but it was part of a process. And then this kind of unique moment of extraordinary series of problems, including that's the site as we received it. There's the photo. And this is the kind of wonderful absurdity of London. Next to that concrete structure on the left by the church, that is 3 jet engines worth of noise and air extract coming out from Crossrail, by which we're putting an auditorium with a 20 decibel rating. So it's kind of, if you're making something, if you're making a theatre, you would not make it on this site. But because of politics and history and life, that's exactly what we did. And then this is the idea of cantilever bridge that is stiffening the office building on the right, the box of the theatre within, the complexity of building on these icebergs. But again, that's the kind of joyful challenge. And then this kind of extraordinary idea that we build an auditorium on dampers, we build a building above the auditorium, and then we build a rehearsal building as a floating building within the building, all because of this Crossrail opportunity. But if Crossrail hadn't come, we wouldn't have the theatre. This is the 12 layers of construction that allow us to do that. And then this is the idea of that perfect room where you can hear a pin drop next to what's the equivalent of a 747 jet on landing and you're 10 meters away. And then there's a kind of wonderful problem of designing a frame to sit on mass dampers on a building that we hadn't designed and just making contingent decisions and saying we'll deal with that down the line. And then these are the models, the processes by which we explore architecture that become mock-ups. And then, of course, the building in the end, when you look at it, it's kind of squeezed between infrastructure. But then architecture is a kind of delightful version of infrastructure within the city. And it's not all buildings can be frontally viewed. If you get a bit of clever camera work, you can. But these buildings are actually kind of anti-rooms to each other, to the public space. The office space is a receptacle to be kind of used. It is the stage set for the life of the office. Old and new coming together, kind of the glimpsing of different architectures at different views, the lavishness of the theatre interior. I talked about beauty. The challenge from Nika Burns, the client for the theatre, was, why can't I have glamour? And then the auditorium itself, kind of a place of escape. It is a public room within the city. And again, that idea of office, church, public space, centre point, much reviled, now listed. You know, again, that idea of architecture, a long game, beware of fashion. And I switched from those to the other because this building can't really be perceived like that, but you can if you've got a clever camera. And this building can be perceived like that. And this is Berkeley Square. And I talked in the film about, you know, the uniqueness of the site, the specialness of the opportunity, the fact that it's a kind of architectural zoo. There's a little bit of the 19th century square. The conservation lobby will only see that, but there's some rather splendidly bad 1930s mega offices, and quite a good building from the 30s, flats and a car showroom, and a less good building from the 90s. Still, an architect was committed to doing something, but it's not so much that I don't like the way it looks. We didn't like the way it worked, and we had to reference the building into its history, and that's important. And we took this image from Perret, a very big shed, how we described that. It doesn't look like a very big shed to me, but I think that was an important idea. And of course, actually behind the historical buildings, behind the facades of the time, this is the Reform Club. Barry's Reform Club is one of the most sophisticated buildings in terms of servicing and infrastructure. And that became, the Perret-Barry reference became an inspiration. So the left is what we're taking down, the right is what we're building. The history of the site has informed this project, but the history of the building on the left and our long history of playing with buildings has informed this project, where we know that the building should stand up on its own and we can play with the middle. That's the soft center that we can adapt so the building can stand up. And the reason we liked that idea wasn't just future and change. Going back to the idea of beauty in the facade, it's a real struggle to make facades, particularly when you can draw whatever you want and it gets made in a factory in Belgium, Spain, and gets brought over and gets clipped on, and it's a kind of environmental veil. So the long history of modernism and freedom has actually proved to be quite difficult for us to deal with, because actually we can do whatever we like. And when you can do whatever you like, it's quite tricky. So the other side benefit of the sway frame, let's look at the interiors, the organization, but the side benefit of the sway frame wasn't, adaptability was one theme, but it was actually the idea that the frame became architecture. And we're back to putting windows into walls, except these walls are quite heroic, load-bearing, stiff frame that doesn't need the bracing of a core in the middle. The core will be built, but it will be adapted. And then how you play with it, how you sculpt it, how you utilize new technologies, precast, low GGBS, low cement, prefabricated components that you can sculpt, and more traditional stone components at the bottom. Nicola talked, when we presented this at WAF, about brutalism, which I take as a real compliment. Maybe a very refined and expensive palazzo in London, but it has a certain kind of brutalist clarity. I show this because often projects, we'd say at the very beginning of a project, and life is full of dilemmas, we don't know what it's going to look like. But it looks, and we will say, well, it'll come. In this one, we knew what it was going to look like on day one because the idea was powerful enough to carry through. So that was the competition winning image of the project. That's the image of the project as it was a few months ago. That's the image of the project now as we've further engineered it. But there's a clear relationship across time between the projects. So I made the beginning slow, the middle relatively quick, because you've seen it. But in a sense, you can give a talk and it becomes a catalogue of projects done. I'm just going to talk at the end a little bit about things we are looking at now. I use that image, one, to be a break in the lecture, but two, Stuart Brand produced the Last Whole Earth catalogue. He also produced the book, How Buildings Learn. And he talked again about Building 22 at MIT, which is the only building that wasn't designed by an architect, but it's produced more Nobel Prize winning scientists than any other building, despite all the money they've invested in those buildings, because the occupants, it was a US Navy, Army, Air Force building. It's a simple timber frame, and they could cut and play with it and use it over time. And this is the edge in the city, around the back of Finsbury Square. It's an idea about a warehouse. So it's a warehouse, it's imagery, it's its construction. It has a simple warehouse logic, not dissimilar to what we're in here. Internally, it's a concrete frame. But it has a timber infill system. It's trying to push the boundaries of how you'd lower the carbon story. But there are challenges beyond design and technology, such as insurance. But this is the kind of journey one's on. The building has to work regardless. This is Belgrove House, opposite King's Cross and St Pancras Station. It's 4 floors of labs, 4 floors of offices, and 2 floors of collaboration spaces. 1 structure for the labs, 1 structure for the offices, and an idea about making a symbol, a monument to 21st century science and production that was a kind of acknowledging across time a relationship with the 2 great stations opposite. Quite a challenge. We shall see as we're building it now how that challenge turns out. But this is that idea about this building representing the the 4th industrial revolution into the future. Bed, a new project in the city. And I show this because it represents where we are looking now beyond the story about embodied carbon, operational carbon. This is the idea of the greening of the city. A collaborator of ours talks about London, the urban forest. Walking from here to Old Street is actually an extraordinary green place. Actually, bringing nature, not just back into the city, but from the city into our buildings, is the future. And this, we don't always keep buildings. This is Holloway Women's Prison, which has now become 1,000 homes designed around a park. And what we retain, again, it represents, going back to that Nolly plan, the one thing we keep in that building, because it's quite a fine Victorian castle, rebuilt as an industrialized prison in the 70s, the one thing we retain in that building is the gardens of the women who lived and worked and were incarcerated, problematic, of course, within that prison. But that's the mature legacy and the memory of their engagement. So the entire project is defined by the landscape that is left once the buildings are removed, and that we then reframe, resituate, and reorganize. And then just coming to the end, in our little journey in America, it's been about learning about, right in the middle of America, in Oklahoma, but expanding out to the west, to the East Coast, about actually the kind of return to that Miesian thing about industrial construction. They build industrial construction pretty well in America. Not always sure about the architecture. All those great towers, there's no idea about the promenade. It's just, let's skin it. Who does the prettiest skin? But we're kind of revisiting again. By going there, we're learning a lot, ideas that were exported from London, but also importing. The idea about shipping containers making pop-up cities. The idea about bringing back streetscape to a town where we don't have any cars in London. In Oklahoma, it's 1 car per room, and they normally got 6 wheels. So it's about kind of exporting some European sensibilities. Obviously, there's a certain Americana fantasy that one enjoys with these big trains that run for 24 hours across the country. But then taking that research project of pop-up containers and then finding a maverick individual who's not a professional client, that can also be very good, the naive client, the naive architect, making shipping containers, sliding them, as we did at Burntwood in plan, but here they're being slid in section, to make Squirrel Park, which is a new residential suburban model built around a green oasis. Social Capital is a club and a bar built around a reused petrol station. The Western Gateway Elementary School I like because we have to build a typhoon centre because the city gets ripped apart every so often. Healthy living in Dallas. I mean, there isn't much healthy living in Dallas, but that's the ambition of the project. And then this building, which we have a joke, is the kind of marijuana factory. It's not actually; it's a restaurant. It's with a kind of urban allotment on top. But you find, by kind of going back to our history of meeting these maverick characters, that a less professional version of architecture is interesting. Here we're recycling an industrial storage building into the new Texas Ballet. So we're cutting and playing and making some theatre out of a found building. And then here at the memorial in Oklahoma, a very important site. In fact, the American AIA gold medalist was the architect. She was the architect for this site, placing a new London idea of an office. So it's kind of got potential for low energy. It's got better volumes. It's got a much more urban skin. It mixes up a club with work, with facilities on the roof. It's the same challenge in another place, as is this building with Google in India. This is a building for 25,000 people. It's an idea of a single object building that addresses the fact that every other building in Hyderabad has a glass skin with a shading device. And our idea was simply, we know that they have wonderful craftspeople. They can make amazing concrete, and they use concrete almost exclusively, but actually it is the generic material of the country. Actually, if you can make a frame, make the facade disappear, you've got a lift package, you've got natural ventilation through the courtyards. It's an indoor-outdoor building. It's a piece of city gathered together to allow people over time to invent a different way of living and working. So it's kind of saying, actually, what you were doing in India up till the invention of modern architecture and its import was far more sophisticated. We're learning by revisiting. So I'll end there, really, with that slide. This is Marseille. This is the Transporter Bridge. Architecture isn't, in our practice, but I think in any form of architectural practice, it's a journey. The uncertainty of the journey is good. Not knowing what you're doing is good. And as Cedric Price said, it's not about designing bridges. It's about how do you get to the other side? How do you take the next step? That's it. Thank you very much.